It listed 10 critical issues facing humanity. Climate change was certainly one of them, and there's no question about its pervasive, hugely pervasive costs. But it also talked about the scale of biodiversity loss and the impact that progressive loss of biodiversity will have on basically collapsing ecosystems. It talked about the nitrogen cycle. We're 4 times, according to them, we have to reduce our use of nitrogen and pollution, emission of nitrogen into the atmosphere and into groundwater and into water by 75%, our agricultural systems. So we have got a pattern, a historical pattern of overconsumption and growth, which is not just about carbon. Carbon is clearly a huge threat, but it is not really where we have to go to answer that threat. Instead, we have to talk about really tough stuff. We have to talk about capitalism. We have to talk about the nature of the economic system that we all live with, that is part of who we are, that we breathe in ourselves, that is just the background to our lives. We have to kind of ask questions about that. We have to look at our governments and the nature of the state system that we've created, and what our democracy has achieved and is capable of achieving. And to do that, and this is why I think this series is an important one, is we need to develop our own knowledge. We need to actually be able critically to engage in understanding how these systems work and what's possible with them and what are the obstacles. But to do that, we don't just have to understand it, we have to be able to talk about it. And that's going to be my numero uno message tonight, is the need to have what I call a conversation, a social conversation that is not presently taking place. One of the reasons it's not taking place, as soon as you mention capitalism in a critical way, you are outside the tents. And that was part of the run-of-river issue, right? That some of the environmentalists who are inside the tent, they want to influence policy by being credible to decision makers. As soon as you start being too critical, you're outside. We have what I call a line. There's a line above the line. You can, as long as you talk in language that's not threatening, it's okay. Below the line, you're gone. We have to get rid of that line. So I want to talk now, my second part of this is about the nature of that line. And a couple of weeks ago, there was a head popped up through the line in the form of Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Economics Prize for her work on the commons. And I say it popped up above the line because her work has been going on for 20 years. People have been talking about the commons for a lot longer than that. But she now got recognized by the Nobel Prize givers, and it was a political decision, because they're saying we have to think about economics differently. And what Ostrom has studied is the commons, which is to say basically communities that self-regulate, look after resources themselves. Our Aboriginal communities are a good example of commons management. Their own rules and customs that are embedded in who they are in their place, and they regulate it. They don't regulate it through government or through a market. And her argument was, that's very important, and we should pay attention to that. And the recognition of her for that by the Academy was surprising, because it's really, I mean, there are those who could cast her analysis in a way sympathetic to the market, but it really was a recognition of non-market forms of resource use and management and life exchanges, economic exchanges. The most famous story of the commons, and many of you will have heard this, anyone who's gone through any social science class in university will have heard Garrett Hardin's famous article in Science, the journal Science in 1967, I think, The Tragedy of the Commons. And his argument in that was that groups that do the sort of management I was talking about, commons management, don't work. And the reason they don't work is because it actually pays for an individual to ignore the needs of the group and get as much as they can individually. And so everyone will will be tempted to overgraze the commons rather than collectively protect it. And the only solution, Hardin argued, was privatize it. Break it up into private property. And the long literature has followed that. Mainstream economics embraced Hardin as why we have to privatize resources in order to make them to have them well managed. But a dissident, a below the line, if you want, literature flowed and said, yeah, that's what's happened all right. That's how we've grown. Development as enclosure. We have developed as an economic society by enclosing the commons, by privatizing it, by pushing Aboriginal people off, by taking other forms of community and management and marginalizing them, and saying, no, let's privatize it. And with the assistance of government, of the state, colonialism. So not just the market, but the state as well. Ostrom, the recognition of Ostrom and the Nobel Prize is pretty big, is we got to start thinking about this. We got to start talking about this. Now, next year, the Nobel Prize should go to Herman Daly. Now that would really be quite a shock. Herman Daly and his mentor Georgescu Roygan, who wrote a book in the early 1970s called Economics and the Entropy Process. And what Daly is famous for, much more radical critique than Ostrom, is that what he calls the steady state economy, which is to say an economy, whenever we do something, whenever we build something, the very fact of building it has costs. Has high costs. And the example that's widely used, if you take a high cost that you can't get back. If you want to have a fire in your fireplace, and you take a log and you put that log in the fireplace, that log has got embedded energy in it. There you can hold it, and you can get stuff from that. You can get heat from it. So you put it in your fireplace, you get heat. At the end, you got heat. It's not that it's disappeared, it's dissipated. And you've got ashes. You can't put that back together. Anytime you build a car or anything, this room, you've got to use that type of energy which is embedded and embodied and consume it and turn it into non-usable energy. Moving from high entropy to low entropy, where you do not have that embedded energy and it's gone. So the implications of that, if the Nobel Prize were to go to Daly, would be, well, an economy that's based on throwing lots of wood in the fireplace or lots of energy into building cars is actually creating a lot of disorder by the very fact of creating all these things. And Daly's argument is that we need to move from an economy based on flow, lots of economic activity, stimulus, to one based on stock, having structures that are stable, long-term, and require as minimum throughput as possible. And he, of course, situates his argument in laws of thermodynamics and said, this is the way the world is. This is a law of nature. And a flow economy, an economy constantly seeking more growth, is actually going up against the laws of nature. And that particularly, the thermodynamic laws of nature. Well, that's pretty radical, and that would bring some change to people's discussions of the nature of our economy. Maybe there will be a Nobel Prize. People have talked for years that Daly and Georgescu Roygan, who's now dead, but posthumously deserve a Nobel Prize, because that's such a radical insight, a critical insight that's gives us lots of opportunity for new directions, new ways to look. We can go back even further, below the line. Remember, these are all economists who are not mainstream economists. Go back another step. Very famous writer Karl Polanyi, who in the 1940s wrote a great book, The Great Transformation. I think Polanyi's grandson is John Polanyi, the chemist at University of Toronto who got the Nobel Prize in chemistry. I'm pretty sure it's his grandson. But his argument, like Ostrom, was that societies, the commons, was really how the whole world has worked in all societies except very highly organized societies. But above all, to take the market and to make the market the center of all of our actions is to undermine these communal structures in ways that cannot be sustained. And he had a very famous line about Adam Smith, who wrote in his famous work in the 1770s that the natural tendency of humankind is to truck, barter, and trade. And he said, Polanyi says, nonsense. That's not true at all. Yeah, people have markets, but they're always small. They're always at the side of the economy. It's much more redistribution and gift-giving and reciprocity and looking after your household. It's not a market-based economy. There's not market-based economies. And his